Korean conflict and then the Vietnam conflict. Whereas we don't think about it that way when we think about World War II. When we think about World War II, we think about it as the good guys versus the bad guys.
The Vietnam War was a harrowing conflict that combined intense physical hardship with devastating psychological tolls. U.S. soldiers were sent into dense jungles and unfamiliar terrain, battling an expert enemy that thrived on secrecy and ambush tactics. The Vietcong, the military arm of the National Liberation Front, were masters of guerrilla warfare, blending with civilians and launching surprise attacks that went beyond anything anyone else had done at that point. In this video, we're going to take a look at some of the unspeakable things the Vietcong did to U.S. soldiers. 1. Punji pit traps. Punji pit traps were one of the most infamous and devastating weapons used by the Vietcong during the Vietnam War. These simple yet deadly contraptions consisted of pits dug into the ground and lined with sharpened bamboo stakes, often camouflaged with natural debris, such as grass or leaves. The traps were ingeniously designed to blend seamlessly into the environment, making them nearly impossible to detect. The sharpened stakes were sometimes treated with substances like feces or decaying material. This wasn't just a gruesome detail, it served a calculated purpose. When soldiers fell into these traps, they didn't just suffer puncture wounds, they also faced the significant risk of infections like tetanus or gangrene. Without proper medical care, these infections could lead to long-term health complications or even death, making the traps doubly effective. The psychological impact on soldiers was also immense. Walking through the dense jungle, every step held the potential for excruciating injury, creating an atmosphere of constant dread. The depth and severity of the injuries inflicted by punji traps often rendered soldiers unfit for combat, sidelining them for weeks or months. In some cases, even minor wounds caused by the bamboo stakes could escalate into life-threatening conditions. U.S. forces attempted to mitigate these dangers by employing tactics like leading with mine detectors or probing the ground with tools, but the trap's simplicity and the Vietcong's resourceful placements made complete prevention impossible. Punji pit traps brought us face to face with the ingenuity and cruelty of guerrilla warfare. The Vietcong turned minimal resources into maximum impact, reminding U.S. forces that technological superiority was not enough to dominate in an environment where the enemy could weaponize even the ground they stood on. This tactic left both physical scars and enduring psychological effects on the soldiers. 2. Ambushes and hit-and-run tactics. The Vietcong's ambushes and hit-and-run tactics were among their most effective strategies during the Vietnam War, leveraging the element of surprise to disrupt and demoralize U.S. forces. These ambushes were carefully planned, typically occurring in dense jungles, along winding roads, or under the cover of night. The Vietcong's deep understanding of their terrain gave them a distinct advantage, allowing them to strike from concealed positions and vanish before a counterattack could be launched. In an ambush, Vietcong soldiers would often position themselves along jungle trails or near U.S. patrol routes. Utilizing dense vegetation for concealment, they would set traps, prepare overlapping fields of fire, and create choke points to ensure maximum casualties. The attacks were sudden, fierce, and disorienting, often accompanied by coordinated bursts of gunfire, grenades, or improvised explosives. For U.S. troops, this meant being under attack before they could even identify the enemy's position, heightening the chaos of these encounters. Hit-and-run tactics were equally disconcerting. Vietcong units would execute lightning-fast strikes on isolated outposts, convoys, or supply lines and withdraw just as quickly. These operations caused not only significant material damage, but also a continuous sense of vulnerability among U.S. forces. Nighttime attacks, in particular, amplified psychological stress, as soldiers grappled with exhaustion and the inability to see their attackers clearly. These tactics were emblematic of guerrilla warfare, where conventional military strength was outmaneuvered by asymmetric and highly adaptable methods. For the Vietcong, it wasn't about holding ground, but inflicting damage, creating uncertainty, and wearing down their opponent. The ambushes and hit-and-run strategies underscored the reality of fighting an enemy deeply embedded in the landscape, elusive and deadly at every turn. 3. Tunneling warfare. The Viet Cong's use of tunneling warfare was a cornerstone of their strategy, creating an intricate underground network that gave them unparalleled mobility and a secure base of operations. These tunnels, often spanning vast areas, enabled the Viet Cong to move troops, transport supplies, and launch surprise attacks without being detected by U.S. forces. Hidden entrances were expertly camouflaged, making them nearly impossible to spot, even for seasoned soldiers. Tunnels served a variety of purposes, acting as living quarters, weapons storage, and command centers. They were often complete with ventilation systems, kitchens that disperse smoke through hidden exits, and multiple escape routes. The Siu Chi tunnels, for example, stretched for over 120 miles and exemplified the scale and sophistication of these subterranean fortresses. Inside, the Viet Cong could safely prepare for operations or weather aerial bombings while remaining undetected. For U.S. soldiers tasked with rooting out Viet Cong forces, the tunnels posed a harrowing challenge. Specialized troops, nicknamed tunnel rats, were sent into these dark, cramped, and often booby-trapped environments armed with only a flashlight, pistol, and nerves of steel. They faced hidden spikes, tripwire grenades, and toxic gas traps set to maim or kill intruders. The psychological toll of crawling through narrow, pitch-black corridors, knowing an ambush could happen at any moment, was immense. The tunnels allowed the Viet Cong to negate the overwhelming firepower and mobility of U.S. forces, ensuring the jungle remained their domain. The Viet Cong turned the tunnels into a devastating weapon that frustrated and confounded their opponents at every turn. 4. Booby traps. The Viet Cong's use of booby traps demonstrated their ingenuity and relentless determination to thwart U.S. forces, even with limited resources. These traps transformed the jungle into a treacherous battlefield, where every step carried the potential for severe injury or death. Simple yet effective, booby traps were often constructed from readily available materials like bamboo, metal scraps, and discarded U.S. explosives. One common tactic involved tripwires connected to grenades, set to detonate when triggered by an unsuspecting soldier. These devices were often placed at foot level or disguised amidst dense foliage, making them hard to detect. Another deadly innovation was the bamboo whip, a spring-loaded mechanism with sharpened spikes that swung down with incredible force when a tripwire was disturbed. The positioning of such traps ensured they targeted vital areas of the body, often resulting in devastating injuries. The variety of these traps, ranging from pressure plates that triggered explosive charges to swinging logs with embedded nails, meant no area of the jungle was safe. Each trap was strategically placed along trails, around bases, or in locations soldiers might naturally use for cover. The psychological impact of these traps was profound. Soldiers became hyper-vigilant, constantly scanning their surroundings and battling a growing sense of paranoia. The ever-present threat of hidden danger eroded morale and forced U.S. forces to divert time and energy to clearing paths or investigating suspicious areas. The simplicity and effectiveness of booby traps illustrated the Viet Cong's ability to weaponize their environment. They turned every step the enemy took into a gamble, leveraging fear and attrition to counter the superior manpower and firepower of U.S. forces. 5. Psychological warfare. The Viet Cong's psychological warfare tactics were designed to sow confusion, destroy morale, and instill a pervasive sense of fear among U.S. troops. These strategies, often low cost but highly effective, targeted the mental and emotional well-being of their adversaries, making an already grueling conflict that much worse. One method involved the use of loudspeakers positioned in hidden locations near U.S. encampments. These would broadcast propaganda messages in English, appealing to soldiers' fears and frustrations. Phrases like, "Your leaders have abandoned you," or "Go home while you still can," aimed to exploit doubts and homesickness. Some broadcasts included scary sounds, such as women weeping or children crying, to create feelings of guilt and unease, particularly in a jungle environment where clarity was already a luxury. Another horrifying tactic was the use of false civilian personas. Viet Cong fighters would often blend seamlessly with local populations, creating a constant state of uncertainty for U.S. forces. Soldiers couldn't always distinguish between a friendly villager offering assistance and an enemy gathering intelligence or preparing for an attack. This uncertainty fostered mistrust and hesitation, weakening the soldiers' ability to respond effectively. These tactics weren't just meant to confuse the enemy, but also to exhaust them mentally. Nighttime noises, including deliberately staged skirmishes or random gunshots, disrupted sleep patterns, leaving troops perpetually on edge. Fear of ambushes, traps, or betrayal from seemingly harmless civilians further heightened the psychological toll. By undermining morale and creating an atmosphere of relentless paranoia, these tactics forced U.S. forces to fight not just an external enemy, but also an internal battle against their own mounting fears and insecurities. 6. Torture and execution of prisoners. Torture and execution of prisoners by the Vietcong were brutal components of the psychological and physical warfare tactics employed during the Vietnam War. While the U.S. military adhered to established conventions for the treatment of prisoners of war, the Vietcong operated with less regard for such principles. The capture of U.S. soldiers often meant more than just being held for ransom or intelligence. It marked the beginning of a harrowing ordeal meant to demoralize both the individual and their fellow troops. One of the most common torture methods involved starvation. Prisoners would be given minimal food, enough to keep them alive but far from sustaining, creating both physical and mental torment. The lack of food was meant to break their resolve, forcing them to submit to whatever demands their captors made. Prolonged exposure to this cruel treatment often led to malnutrition, weakening the prisoners and diminishing their resistance. Physical abuse was also used. Captives were frequently subjected to severe beatings, often with bamboo canes, whips, or fists. In some cases, they were tied to posts or trees and whipped, sometimes to the point of death. The purpose of this abuse was twofold: to extract confessions or valuable intelligence and to demonstrate the Viet Cong's power over their captives. Such violence was intended to terrorize U.S. forces into avoiding capture at all costs, knowing what awaited them if they were taken prisoner. Psychological degradation was another significant form of torture. Prisoners could be forced to degrade themselves, publicly humiliating them in front of other soldiers or local civilians. The Viet Cong also made frequent use of mock executions to further terrorize their captives, creating an atmosphere where death was ever present, but its arrival unpredictable. While these tactics were infamously effective in instilling fear among U.S. soldiers, the legacy of this brutality left psychological scars that lasted long after the war ended for many veterans. The pain inflicted was not just physical, it was deeply psychological, a torment that fueled the fear of being captured in the thick jungles of Vietnam. 7. Fake surrender. Fake surrender ruses were a psychological and tactical maneuver employed by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War, making it difficult for U.S. soldiers to trust their surroundings or their enemies. In these situations, Viet Cong fighters would appear to give up, dropping their weapons and signaling their intent to surrender. However, this deceptive tactic was meant to lull American forces into a false sense of security, only to trap them moments later. The Viet Cong understood that surrendering often led to a temporary pause in hostilities. As a result, they began to exploit this moment, using it as a trick to draw in unsuspecting U.S. soldiers. Once the soldiers lowered their guard or approached the supposed surrendering enemy, the Viet Cong would launch an immediate and often overwhelming counterattack. This attack would occur with rifles, grenades, or even hidden explosives, resulting in casualties and further intimidating American forces. These tactics played into the psychological vulnerability of soldiers who faced an unpredictable and elusive enemy. It planted seeds of distrust and caution within U.S. troops, who began to question whether any potential surrender was genuine or just another part of the enemy's complex web of traps. The effectiveness of this ruse was enhanced by the terrain and the constant nature of the fighting. The dense jungles and the widespread presence of the Viet Cong meant that soldiers never truly knew whether the person in front of them was a threat. Fear of ambushes added even more psychological strain, as troops moved through areas where any encounter could turn fatal. The fake surrender tactic was one more reminder of how the enemy used psychological warfare to chip away at the resolve of U.S. soldiers. 8. Mock executions. Mock executions were another brutal psychological tactic employed by the Vietcong during the Vietnam War. These deceptive acts were meant to break the spirit of American prisoners, instill fear, and send a clear message about the consequences of being captured. Instead of immediately killing their prisoners, the Viet Cong would go through the motions of an execution to manipulate their emotions and extract vital information. A mock execution typically began with the prisoner being lined up and made to kneel or stand as if preparing to be shot. At this point, the soldier or captured person would be blindfolded, creating an intense feeling of uncertainty and panic. Viet Cong fighters would often imitate the formal steps of execution, loading weapons, preparing to fire, or drawing knives, making the situation feel real. Just as the prisoner braced for death, the gunfire would either miss or be blanks fired close to the person, amplifying the fear and disorientation. Beyond just the psychological shock of the moment, these mock executions were intended to instill a sense of hopelessness in U.S. soldiers. As captives underwent repeated simulations of death, their sense of control and confidence were shattered. It was a brutal tool used to sow confusion and fear. And over time, even those who survived these executions were left physically and mentally scarred. These tactics also had a strategic purpose. By leaving prisoners in a constant state of fear, the Viet Cong hoped to weaken their resilience, ultimately making them more likely to provide information or cooperate in further interrogations. The ultimate goal was to break their morale so thoroughly that they would willingly share whatever intelligence was needed. The sense of emotional and physical helplessness inflicted by mock executions played a major role in undermining American resolve and ensuring that any captured soldiers were mentally rattled. 9. Child soldiers and human shields. Child soldiers and human shields represented some of the most harrowing tactics used by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. The use of children in combat and for strategic purposes was deeply troubling, as it compounded the psychological and moral difficulties of the conflict. Children were often deployed by the Viet Cong as scouts, messengers, and occasionally even as combatants. Children, given their size and ability to move without arousing suspicion, were often used to gather intelligence on American patrols or positions. They could sneak across enemy lines undetected or move through hostile areas more freely than adult fighters. These young individuals were also sent to deliver messages, reinforcing the feeling of paranoia among U.S. forces. The U.S. soldiers had to be cautious, sometimes unable to tell whether a child was a threat or an innocent civilian. This uncertainty created a complicated dilemma where firing on a child could risk civilian casualties, but not doing so could expose the soldiers to ambushes or further attacks. In more extreme cases, children were involved directly in combat. Some were conscripted to serve as soldiers for the Viet Cong, often in support roles, but in certain circumstances, they were handed weapons and forced into dangerous battle situations. This not only undermined the moral clarity of the U.S. forces, but also deepened the psychological strain. Soldiers found it deeply unsettling to face an enemy that could include children among their ranks. In addition to using children for tactical operations, the Viet Cong also placed civilians in harm's way as human shields. In these instances, the Viet Cong would sometimes force villagers into dangerous areas, creating a strong deterrent against U.S. strikes. Attacking positions that were too close to civilians was viewed as both morally challenging and politically risky for the Americans, as civilian casualties would negatively impact U.S. public support for the war. These tactics made the combat environment even more dangerous, and U.S. forces were faced with the challenge of distinguishing combatants from civilians, all while dealing with the pressure to limit harm to innocent bystanders. For the Viet Cong, the use of children and civilians not only served a tactical role, but also complicated any efforts to achieve a quick or decisive victory, ensuring that the war's toll on both soldiers and civilians alike would be excruciatingly high. 10. Sabotage of supply lines. Sabotage of supply lines often took place through a variety of means, such as planting bombs, mines, or using ambush tactics along convoys. Roadways were frequently sabotaged by blowing up bridges or planting landmines, making supply routes treacherous for U.S. soldiers. These tactics were designed to prevent American reinforcements and vital supplies, ammunition, medical equipment, fuel, and food from reaching their destinations. The disruption to supply lines significantly impaired U.S. military efforts and led to increased pressure on soldiers to operate with dwindling resources. The supply shortages caused by these attacks left American forces struggling to maintain their operational effectiveness. For example, ammunition often became scarce in certain areas, limiting U.S. firepower in combat situations. Additionally, medical supplies and equipment were frequently jeopardized, making it harder for medics to treat the wounded or respond to the ever-present risk of injuries. This not only compromised soldiers' safety and well-being, but also heightened morale issues, as troops realized that their survival depended not only on engaging the enemy, but also on an ongoing struggle to secure and preserve essential supplies. In addition to direct sabotage, the threat of disrupting logistics operations forced the U.S. military to divert substantial resources to guard vulnerable supply lines, further stretching their manpower. Combat units often found themselves stretched thin as a result of trying to maintain essential supplies while also fighting off enemy attacks. This constant strain added to the sense of constant unease among American soldiers, who found themselves fighting not just the Vietcong, but also the debilitating impact of logistical and resource limitations. 11. Exploitation of terrain. The Vietcong's exploitation of the natural terrain of Vietnam played a pivotal role in their ability to conduct guerrilla warfare effectively against the U.S. military. Deeply familiar with the dense jungles, rivers, and marshes of the region, Vietcong fighters expertly used the landscape to their advantage, crafting deadly ambushes and setting traps that were nearly impossible for American forces to anticipate or counter. Jungle terrain, with its thick foliage and undergrowth, offered perfect cover for Vietcong forces. The U.S. soldiers, who were often unfamiliar with the nuances of fighting in such an environment, struggled to navigate the dense forests, which hindered their visibility and ability to detect ambushes. Vietcong fighters would blend seamlessly into the jungle, often moving silently and hiding in plain sight, making it difficult for U.S. troops to distinguish between friendly and enemy forces. These forces could strike swiftly and retreat before the Americans could respond, causing disruption and leaving a trail of casualties. Rivers and marshes, with their unpredictable, often treacherous conditions, allowed the Vietcong to move unseen and evade detection by U.S. forces. The Vietcong were skilled at using the waterways for transportation, relying on small boats or even swimming to move quickly and quietly. This mastery over the waterways enabled them to conduct hit-and-run attacks from unexpected angles, forcing U.S. forces to stretch their security measures to try and protect every vulnerable route. Riverbanks also became sites for ambushes, with fighters lying in wait until a vulnerable convoy or patrol came close enough to be attacked with deadly precision. In addition, marshlands posed a unique challenge. The constant swampy conditions made movement slow and difficult for U.S. forces, who often became bogged down in the muck while chasing the enemy. In these difficult conditions, Vietcong forces used their knowledge of the terrain to control their surroundings, sometimes making it hard for U.S. troops to differentiate between areas that might be safe or perilous, further complicating operations. This tactical advantage, using the environment as both shield and weapon, contributed to the Vietcong's ability to wage an asymmetric war, frustrating and depleting U.S. forces. The exploitation of terrain ultimately made it harder for American forces to maintain momentum, straining their resources and morale while the Vietcong adapted and thrived in their surroundings. Would you be able to survive all of this brutal torture at the hands of the Vietcong?